Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. It is the year 1850. There is no American flag over New York Harbor. Instead, the Union Jack still flies above the Customs House, just as it has for nearly a century. George Washington is long dead. He never became a revolutionary icon. He died quietly, remembered as a capable British officer who once put down unrest rather than leading it. West of the Appalachians, the land does not belong to farmers and settlers, but to powerful native confederations that still control the plains. To the south, the Cherokee remain on their ancestral ground, weakened, pressured, but not erased. Across the Atlantic, France watches this world with unease. Its king still rules. There was no revolution, no guillotine, no emperor rising from the chaos. Europe is tense, competitive, and restless, but it has not exploded. This is the world that exists when the American Revolution does not fail in battle. It simply never succeeds. In the 1760s, Britain's American colonies are not a society preparing to break away. They are expanding, increasingly wealthy, and deeply tied to the largest empire on earth. Most colonists do not think of themselves as future Americans. They think of themselves as British subjects, often frustrated ones, but British all the same. Tensions rise after the 7 Years' War, when Britain attempts to impose new taxes and regulations on its colonies. Riots erupt over the Stamp Act. Merchants boycott British goods. Crowds gather, shout, and sometimes turn violent. Yet each time unrest flares, it is followed not by separation, but by negotiation. Parliament repeals taxes. Anger subsides. The moment passes. This pattern matters. Revolutions are not born from anger alone. They require a closing of exits. Here, the exits remain open. Compromise is imperfect, but it still exists. The empire bends just enough to prevent a clean break. From London, the calculus is blunt. Britain has just fought the most expensive war in its history to remove France from North America. The colonies benefited directly from that victory. When British officials demand that colonists help pay for their own defense, they see it not as oppression, but as arithmetic. Order must be funded. Empires are not free. Colonial leaders argue back, but most do not argue for independence. They want representation, exemptions, influence, not revolution. Even figures who would later become symbols of rebellion remain, in this world, loyal critics rather than separatists. George Washington is one of them, ambitious, disciplined, and deeply invested in imperial order rather than its destruction. When violence threatens to spiral, Britain responds decisively, but not catastrophically. Troops are deployed. Riots are broken up. Leaders are pressured, not martyred. The empire makes clear that unrest has consequences, but it also makes concessions just sufficient to prevent total alienation. Without a declaration to rally behind, there is no war to harden identities. Without a war, there is no moment when loyalty becomes impossible. The colonial crisis fades into memory as another imperial dispute, intense, bitter, but ultimately contained. And in that containment, something far more consequential happens. The American Revolution does not become history's turning point. It becomes a road not taken. And the continent that might have birthed a republic instead remains an imperial possession, its future no longer driven by rebellion, but by restraint. After the crisis fades, Britain moves to lock the continent in place. In London, the decision is not ideological, it is financial. The empire has just paid dearly to defeat France, and officials are determined not to be dragged into another endless frontier war. The solution is blunt and enforceable. Settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains is restricted. Land grants are limited. Military patrols enforce boundaries that colonists had assumed would always keep moving west. The message is clear. The frontier is no longer a promise. It is a liability. For settlers who dreamed of land, this is not an abstract policy. It is a closed door. Speculators who expected fortunes from Western acreage find themselves blocked by imperial law. Ambition collides with authority, and authority wins. The empire has decided that peace is cheaper than expansion. This choice reshapes lives in quiet but permanent ways. Thomas Jefferson never becomes a visionary landholder with an eye on a continental republic. Without access to Western speculation, he remains a minor lawyer and pamphleteer, educated, articulate, and ultimately irrelevant. His talents have no frontier to attach themselves to. and history never calls his name. Britain enforces these limits not because it fears the colonies, but because it understands them. Every new settlement would require soldiers, forts, and diplomacy with native nations who still command real power. The empire has learned this lesson the hard way. Uncontrolled expansion does not create wealth. It creates wars the treasury cannot afford. Along the coast, life continues much as before. Ports grow busier, trade deepens, cities prosper. But inland, the pressure builds. Settlers push illegally, treaties are tested, and skirmishes flare. But each time, British authority intervenes. Land seizures are reversed. Settlements are dismantled. The frontier is kept on a leash. The consequence is a North America that feels strangely unfinished. The land is there, vast and tempting, but access to it is tightly rationed. Opportunity does not vanish, but it is redirected, away from farms and toward commerce, shipping, and imperial service. Those who thrive do so by fitting into the empire, not by escaping it. This restraint preserves something else as well. Beyond the mountains, native nations are not overwhelmed by an endless flood of settlers. They remain weakened and pressured, but intact. The empire has decided that it is easier to negotiate with them than to remove them. And in making that choice, Britain does more than slow expansion. It changes who survives the 19th century and who never gets the chance to shape it. West of the Appalachian line, the continent does not empty itself for settlement. It holds. Native nations that, in another world, would have been crushed within a generation instead remain political actors, constrained, pressured, but not erased. British officials do not see them as a moral cause, nor as an inconvenience to be swept aside. They see them as a cost calculation. War is expensive. Removal is destabilizing. Negotiation, however flawed, is cheaper. This is especially true in the South. The Cherokee in particular occupy land too valuable and too organized to be ignored. They adapt selectively, centralize authority, and engage with imperial law when it serves them. Britain recognizes them not as equals, but as entities worth managing. Treaties are signed, boundaries are drawn, encroachment occurs, but slowly, unevenly, and often reluctantly enforced. There's no trail of tears in this world, because there is no popular government empowered to demand one. There is no election to be won by promising land, no frontier majority to satisfy. When settlers push too far, imperial authorities intervene, not out of compassion, but out of discipline. Order matters more than appeasement. The interior of North America becomes something unusual, a shared space. British traders move through it. Native confederations control it. Authority overlaps rather than replaces. Violence still erupts. Disease still devastates populations, and land is lost over time. But not all at once, and not without resistance that still has meaning. Further north and west, similar patterns hold. Indigenous power fades unevenly rather than collapsing. Confederations rise, adapt, and sometimes fracture under pressure, but they are not immediately overwhelmed by demographic force. The land does not become empty quickly enough to invite conquest without consequence. This changes the moral geography of the continent. Expansion is no longer framed as destiny, but as intrusion. Every mile west requires justification, negotiation, and expense. The absence of a national myth demanding growth leaves only practical questions behind, and practical questions often produce delay. By the early 19th century, North America has become a place where multiple futures remain possible. It is not yet a settler continent, nor is it fully imperialized. It is contested, constrained, and alive with unresolved tension. And that unresolved tension prevents something else from forming. There is still no nation here. No single people convinced the land exists for them alone. The stillness in North America does not stay there. Across the Atlantic, something feels wrong, not because events are unfolding too quickly, but because they are not unfolding at all. France watches Britain retain its colonies, enforce its borders, and avoid the financial catastrophe that rebellion would have brought. The war Paris once expected to exploit never arrives, and with that absence, a chain reaction begins in reverse. In another world, France poured money, weapons, and prestige into the American rebellion, not out of idealism, but revenge. The goal was simple: weaken Britain, no matter the cost. That cost, as history once proved, was enormous. Debt ballooned, credit collapsed. The monarchy lost control of its finances. Here, none of that happens. France still has problems, deep ones. Its tax system remains broken, its nobility remains insulated, its peasantry remains burdened, but the state is not suddenly bankrupt. There is no moment when the treasury fails all at once, no emergency that forces the crown to summon forces it can no longer control. Louis XVI does not become a symbol of paralysis. He remains what he always was: indecisive, insulated, and, most importantly, secure. He grows older, heavier, and increasingly detached, but he's never dragged into the open by crisis. He dies in his bed, unaware that names like Robespierre ever existed. Without American success, there is no revolutionary proof of concept, no example that shows a monarchy can be challenged, defeated, and replaced. French officers never returned from across the Atlantic carrying dangerous ideas along with battlefield experience. Radical imagination remains theoretical. The Estates General may still convene, protests may still erupt, reform may still be debated, but nothing ignites. Authority weakens slowly, leaking power rather than losing it in a single rupture. The system bends, and that bending saves it. And in that preserved order, one future vanishes. There is no moment when chaos opens a path for ambition, no collapse for a young artillery officer to climb through. Napoleon Bonaparte remains exactly what the system allows him to be: competent, constrained, and forgettable. The guillotine never rises in Paris, and without it, Europe never enters the age of acceleration. Without revolution in France, Europe never receives its great shock. The absence of Napoleon is not simply the loss of a single military genius. It is the removal of the force that once ripped apart old structures and forced the continent to adapt at speed. Without him, no state is compelled to mobilize entire populations. No borders are redrawn overnight, and no empire is dismantled by conquest. Wars still occur, but they look familiar. Armies maneuver cautiously. Objectives remain limited. Diplomacy restrains what ambition might otherwise attempt. Conflict is a tool of policy, not an engine of transformation. Europe returns to a rhythm it understands: slow, competitive, but contained. This restraint preserves institutions that, in another timeline, collapsed under pressure. The Holy Roman Empire continues to exist, inefficient and divided, yet intact. German states reform gradually rather than being forcibly reorganized. Political identity develops through law, commerce, and negotiation instead of shared catastrophe. Legal and administrative change follows the same pattern. Without Napoleonic codes imposed by occupation, reform becomes local and reversible. States modernize where it suits them and resist where it threatens entrenched power. Progress is uneven, contested, and often delayed, but it is not erased. Britain watches this Europe with satisfaction. Its naval dominance remains unchallenged, and its wealth continues to flow from trade rather than territory. With no continental superpower to confront, Britain avoids the decades of existential warfare that once drained its resources. Stability, not supremacy, defines its position. By the early 19th century, Europe feels restrained rather than stagnant. The forces of change are present, but they move through existing channels instead of shattering them. Borders are more stable, institutions endure. The old order yields ground slowly, learning how to survive pressure rather than being destroyed by it. And all of this traces back to a silence across the Atlantic, a revolution that never succeeded, a war that never came, and an emperor who never found his moment. By the middle of the 19th century, the shape of the world is recognizable, but subtly wrong. North America has not become a single expanding republic. It remains a patchwork of imperial authority, negotiated boundaries, and surviving indigenous power. British ports along the Atlantic thrive as commercial hubs, deeply tied to global trade. Inland, control fades by degrees rather than collapsing all at once. The continent feels large, restrained, and unresolved. This changes how power behaves everywhere else. Without a successful American rebellion, revolution loses its most convincing precedent. Political movements across Europe still demand reform, but they hesitate longer. Rulers concede earlier, preferring adjustment to confrontation. The lesson absorbed is not that empires can be overthrown, but that they can endure if they bend. Industrialization continues, but without the same ideological urgency. Markets expand, factories rise, and populations grow, yet these forces press against existing systems instead of obliterating them. Inequality persists, conflict remains. But history advances through accumulation rather than eruption, and without a republic pushing a cotton frontier westward, slavery faces a different kind of pressure, contained by imperial law rather than transformed into a national crisis. The absence of the United States reveals something essential about its role in the original timeline. It was not simply another nation among many. It was an accelerant. It compressed decades of pressure into moments of rupture. It turned philosophical arguments into political reality and made speed itself a defining feature of the modern age. Here, without that accelerant, nothing truly stops. Empires do not freeze. Progress does not vanish. But the tempo changes. Borders shift more cautiously. Revolutions hesitate. Power adapts rather than shattering. This is what a world looks like when the American Revolution does not succeed. Not a world without change, but a world without momentum. One where history still moves forward, just slowly enough for old systems to survive. And in that slower world, the significance of the revolution becomes impossible to miss. Because without it, the modern age arrives not as a break, but as a long, deliberate unfolding.